Greetings, friends. Juan and Griska here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian war update for the week of April 8th through April 14th of 2024. And we are still on the cusp of the Russian winter push, which is now the spring push. Now, there's been rumors going around that the Russians are basically been pushing along this entire front line, basically to keep the Ukrainians busy as they are preparing for a actual, real, quote-unquote, big aero offensive. My opinion is that whatever this offensive is, it's actually going to be a localized one. I don't, I mean, I could be wrong, and, maybe there is going to be in the works some sort of big offensive to try to, say, take Kharkiv or something. But, I tend to think that any offensive in this war, until one side is completely exhausted, because this is an attrition war, is going to be it's going to be like how, for example, in October, we saw a massive attack to try to encircle Avdiivka. That's like an example of an offensive, or the offensive on Bakhmut back in the summer, or an event, and such like that. We're not going to see a 200,000 strong army just march into Kharkov and try to and take this entire oblast. I don't think that's happening. I could be wrong, but we'll see. My idea is that the summer offensive for the Russians is going to try to improve the situation on the ground that will go beyond just the meager little small gains that we're seeing. I'm thinking it's going to be an offensive on Chasiv Yar and also on Liman. I think there's going to be something in this area of Luhansk, and I think the goal is that they're going to try to link up and then cut off Seversk. And so I think kind of the main goal of the Russians for the summer offensive that's going to be coming up, that's been rumored, is try to reach the Uskol River here. Capture Liman, capture Chasiv Yar, kind of link up here, near in Ray Alexandria, kind of, or at least put the squeeze on it so that there's only like one road connecting the Seversk pocket, and then slowly force the Ukrainians to give up Seversk, really without a fight, because then they're not going to fight for all these, because all these areas are heavily trenched up to hell. And so the Ukrainians are going to give up Seversk to save themselves and retreat to the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk defense line. That is my opinion on what the summer offensive is going to look like. Something small. It's not going to be like some big aero offensive that's going to shoot them all the way, that's just not how offensive works. And if it is that, it's going to be really, unless the Russians have thousands of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles they could throw away to try to make some sort of breakthrough, we're going to basically see it's going to be very hard for them to succeed. And, either side. We saw that with the Ukrainians, and we saw that with the Russians. The only reason why there was big gains in the beginning in 2022 was because, one, the Russians surprised the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians couldn't defend everywhere at once. And second, the Ukrainians made gains in the end of 2022 because the Russians did not take this war seriously while the Ukrainians did, and thus they outnumbered the Russians and were able to overrun them. Both sides are now taking this war very seriously. They are now evenly matched in manpower. However, the Russians are at a big advantage with firepower. So they can make the slow gains, and the Ukrainians are always on the back foot. But in terms of actually making a breakthrough, we shall see. But I don't think we're at that point yet, but we'll see. Anyway, let's go over what happened in the last week or so. Where shall we begin? Now, the biggest things are happening in the Donetsk front. Let's talk about Donetsk. This is where a lot of the interesting things are going on. Now, one thing we got confirmation of from the Russian Ministry of Defense is the complete capture of Peremyska. I think we talked about this last week because we saw that at the end, we saw the flags of the Russian army getting flown here and such. And so, we got confirmation last week, and I think we talked about it. If not, then yeah, the Russians have taken the western edge of Peremyska. Basically, the advancements in the northern sector here from Toninka kind of forced the collapse of the Ukrainians defending Peremyska. My big question is, what are the Ukrainians doing in this kind of little salient? I know, you don't see it here, but there's probably a ton of trenches that the Ukrainians are guarding here. However, with the capture of Novolska, the Russians could have a very good chance of trying to link up these two kind of pincers and kind of squeeze out this little pocket here, which I think is what they're going to do. But so, I think the Ukrainians are going to fall back into kind of the next line of defense, which is along the Vochachka River, along with all these villages here. That's kind of where the Ukrainian defense line is now anchored after the fall, the original 2014 defense line. So Peremyska has completely fallen, and the Russians are also making more rapid gains in the fields between Toninka and the Vochachka Reservoir right here. A lot of fields have been captured, and basically now the Russians are on the outskirts of Umanska, Yasnobronovka, and Natalova. The Ukrainian defense line is kind of anchored, along. There's a river here, and then there's also, then they also have, Natalova, which is also defended, and then they kind of try to connect these. They have this kind of like amateur defense line along this red line here. And so what the Russians are going to try to do is, so the Russians have basically conquered everything from like Toninka and Orlovka and up to this defense line. Now, what are the Russians going to do? So the Russians this week basically reached the outskirts of kind of this main, they've been taking all these trenches in these fields. However, now they need to sever the actual defense, because right now taking these fields are fine. This led to the collapse of Peremyska. But now it's time to take these three. These three villages need to be taken. However, my prediction is that once these three villages are taken, the Russians are going to do an operational pause. The Ukrainians are going to retreat back here along this Vochachka River. This will be the new Ukrainian defense line. And the Russians are going to basically be... Let's use a different color for the Russians. Let's use blue for some reason. The Russians are going to kind of be along... this area, and then, use these fields as like a no man's land type thing. Now, and remember, the whole reason why they're pushing here is to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk. So they need to take these three to push the Ukrainians back to this line, because once the Ukrainians are pushed back here, then the artillery will be behind the front lines. It'll be near Selidova and all that. And then back here, where the artillery will be, they will be so far, with traditional artillery, they will no longer be able to shell Donetsk. And that was the whole purpose of the attacks on Avdiivka, in Marinka, and so forth. So what are the Russians are going to do now? The Russians have, they've taken, this kind of ravine right here. They are now reaching the outskirts of this. Basically, they're going to continue pushing this way until they sever. They're going to probably reach Yasnobronovka and try to take this small little village. I don't even think it's a village. It's like one of those things that when you zoom in, there's like nothing there. Yeah, like this looks like some sort of campground or some shit. It doesn't look like an actual town. But anyway, they'll take this thing, and then they'll sever the connection between Umanska and Natalova. And once they reach this, they'll sever this main artery, this road here. And then they'll use this reservoir as the defense from on the more western side, and they'll also use this river as a defense. They'll then also take kind of the southern part of Umanska here. Once that happens, the Russians are going to be on the northern edge of Natalova. Now, obviously, attacking Natalova directly from Peremyska is going to be a hard deal, because again, Peremyska has been fought over for almost like 2 years, almost a year and a half or something, and so basically, the Ukrainians didn't just leave this undefended. There's trenches everywhere. This entire village is empty. There's almost nobody here. There's just going to be a ton of... every building is used as some defense point. There's probably dug-in trenches and underground basements and shit. And so attacking directly is an option of attack to pin units, but it would take like another year for them to slowly pass through this. What I'm guessing is the Russians are going to try to attack they'll do a direct attack, but then there'll be an attack once they take Yasnobronovka. There'll be attacks from the north here. And I think these simultaneous attacks from the north will be a big squeeze on Natalova, and I think the Ukrainians might give it up. The only reason why I don't see that, why that might not happen, is because the Ukrainians will still have an advantage in terms of having this road connecting. Now, this will be under fire control, but not only that, they have roads on these fields, and these fields are still under Ukrainian control, so they could still send units from the south into Natalova. This is why I think the connection that the Russians, after they take Yasnobronovka and Umanska, they're going to not take Natalova. Natalova is going to be one of the last villages to fall. I think then they're going to focus their efforts on connecting Novolska and Peremyska, because once this is the new kind of front line, then you could see the Russians kind of squeezing through these open fields to try to put pressure on the Ukrainians supplying Natalova from the south. And then once Natalova is getting assaulted directly from the north and then getting cut off from the south, that's when Natalova is going to fall. that is kind of where I see the Russian axis of attack. First of all, though, we're going to continue seeing them advance towards Yasnobronovka, towards the South Lubanska, and then, cut off Natalova from the north. Natalova will be assaulted directly, and then after that, they're going to try to take out this little salient right here between Novolska and Peremyska. So the Russians are now in a position to do that. Before they took Toninka, 2-3 weeks ago, and now they've been basically pushing through these fields to try to reach this new defense line. A little bit north, Russians are actually making pretty solid progress in Berdichi, and actually in the northern part too. And this is one of the most surprising facts of this week so far. I was kind of expecting that the Russians would use kind of this rail line as a new natural defense point, but it looks like they're not settling for just that. They're now advancing beyond that. Let's talk about it. The Russians took the most of Berdichi. Now, Berdichi is kind of one of those villages that isn't very doesn't have a form. You see that this area is still part of Berdichi, and this is kind of out in the open, out more in the field. So the Russians, while they took kind of the center and eastern part of Berdichi, there's still parts of Berdichi that are still under Ukrainian control, which are hard to take. However, after the Russians took kind of this area of Berdichi, the center part and the eastern, the Russians kind of started advancing along this kind of small river, and kind of captured this area right here, and managed to kind of link up. Because as during the Avdiivka offensive, the Russians were already kind of advanced along this rail line, and this was kind of like the front line. And so the Russians actually already had a position here to kind of give themselves a secure flank as they advanced up towards Berdichi and kind of secured this tree line. My guess is that the new Russian offensive, or the new Russian push, is trying to take, this tree line, this tree line, this tree line, kind of use this tree line as kind of like the forward defense point, because this is where the second Ukrainian line of defense. Remember, the Ukrainians had to build a new line of defense after Avdiivka fell, and it's near Orchechny, Novobakmovka, Novoprokhovska, Novoselivka, Pershi, and so forth. This is the new Ukrainian defense line. And since one thing the Ukrainians did do, while they failed to prevent the Russians from taking the first line of defense after Avdiivka fell, which is Berdichi, Semyonovka, Orlovka, Toninka, and so forth, they did give them enough time with the usage of the strategic reserves to build a new defense line. At least that's what I think. Maybe they're incompetent, maybe they didn't build it, but I'm pretty sure that the Ukrainians have been hard at work at trying to build a new defense line here. So the Russians are basically trying to secure themselves on the second defense line and kind of have the front line. This is where I think now, so right now they're trying to clear Berdichi and kind of make themselves a secure foothold here. Battles are also going on in the center of Semyonovka, and my guess is that since the center of Berdichi has fallen, the Russians are also going to put pressure on the north of Semyonovka, and the squeeze from both sides are probably going to squeeze the Ukrainians out. And the Ukrainians are going to be like little ducklings, little chickens out in the open here, and they're going to fall back to more secure bases out here. So now that we talked about about Berdichi basically getting more taken in the north, here's what I kind of envision the front line going to be like. Let's take red for the Russians. The Russians are going to have a front line kind of like this. Hold up, let me rewrite that. The Russian front line is going to be kind of like this. And then, down to Yasnobronovka, as I mentioned before. Kind of like this. And then the Ukrainian defense line is going to be blue along this area right here. And as you can see, this kind of gives both sides like a killing field. It's basically allow them to have some sort of like, in these fields will be like kind of like if anyone wants to attack here or here, there's going to be a hell to pay for that. And so it's going to be very hard for the Russians or the Ukrainians to dislodge them. But that's where I think. But again, if the Ukrainians fall back, here, then the Ukrainian artillery will be back here. So Ukrainian artillery will be like around this area. And when they're back here, again, this is so far off from, with conventional artillery, this is so far away from Donetsk that, it's going to be very hard for the Ukrainians to actually shell Donetsk, aside from like HIMARS and such, but those are in very low supply, so they can't just shoot random civilians with it like they could with conventional artillery. Again, that's the whole purpose of this Avdiivka operation, or just anywhere in Donetsk really, is to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk. So that's where there's been movements towards capture. They captured the northern edge of Berdichi in the center. They've reached the outskirts of Umanska and Yasna Bronovka and Talova, and we're now in the final weeks. I'm expecting by the end of April probably to see Berdichi and Sinonica finally fully taken. The Ukrainians will retreat back to their normal line, and the Russians will begin assault operations to take Umanska and Yasna Bronovka. The fall of Natalova might take a little while longer because of just how much defended it is, but with the Russians encroaching from the north, I could see them falling a lot faster than Peremyska did. So that's kind of what's happening in the northern front. One thing also to mention here is the Russians made a very interesting play here. The Russians are now attacking Nova Kalinova, and I was kind of surprised. I was expecting, again, this is where the Ukrainian defense line kind of ran along kind of these towns, and the Russian defense line kind of ran along kind of this rail line, and so you kind of had an interesting battlefield dynamic. And I don't know if because the Ukrainians have been using so many troops in attacking Berdichi that they kind of this area right here in the north of Avdiivka has been kind of filtered out, but somehow the Russians have basically made some sort of breakthrough and managed to capture kind of the outskirts of Nova Kalinova. They've taken these like farm fields right here, and now they say the battles are going along these two streets right here. So the clasters are going on the easternmost edge of Nova Kalinova. And if the Russians manage to take these two streets, then they could basically kind of do like a hook and kind of start battling for the center of Nova Kalinova. This is very interesting, so the Russians basically advanced from their rail line positions and basically entered Nova Kalinova from the east here. We saw the Ukrainians try to attack them with drones on these farm fields. And so battles are going on for these two streets, and the capture of Nova Kalinova and even maybe Karamik, which is another village in this, kind of connected to Nova Kalinova, will kind of break this defense. The Ukrainians had a very solid defense, kind of a straight line here. However, let's say the Russians take Nova Kalinova and Karamik, for example. This will be the new front line, and then the Russians will be able to kind of maybe go to the west here and start battling for Arkhangelsk here, start battling for Chechny from the east here, and so this could put a lot of pressure on Chechny. We actually saw this at the end of this week too. The Russians are now battling for this is kind of like a forward defense point that the Ukrainians have, this kind of dacha of Chechny right here, and so the Russians have actually entered it and are now battling for this dacha, and so the capture of Nova Kalinova would put a lot of, will put the Ukrainian defenses in the north of Avdiivka very much in danger, and will allow for the Russians, if they so choose, if they want to maybe continue the attack to try to capture Nova Bukhnivka, Novoselivka, Pershi, to kind of be more at risk, because then, if the Ukrainians are trying to defend the Russians here, right, and the Russians took Nova Kalinova, well then, if they're battling at your rear, they're like, oh shit, the Russians are attacking north here, and then, they're also attacking from the south, well then that will facilitate the fall of this very quickly. Maybe this is just a pinning maneuver, maybe they're just trying to pin Ukrainian forces here, but it is very interesting that the Russians have entered Nova Kalinova. So lots of things happening. The Russians are still are in a cleanup operation to continue trying to clean out to trying to kind of push out the Ukrainians away from Donetsk here. And so they still have a little bit more ways to go here. While we're on this discussion, however, let's talk about the southern act, because this is still in relation to the northern part of Avdiivka. Because, again, this is where the Ukrainians still have positions to shell Donetsk. Right now, they have their defense line in Krasnogorivka, and so the Ukrainians could have artillery here, and this is still close enough where they could shell Donetsk with conventional artillery. Again, the whole purpose of this operation is to push the Ukrainians back here, and so hence why they need to take Krasnogorivka. Krasnogorivka is a big nut to crack because it is one of the biggest towns that is on the Donetsk border. It has high-rise buildings, unlike the other villages the Russians took. It has a industrial center. So Avdiivka is like probably the hardest part, but Krasnogorivka gives it a run for its money. And unlike Avdiivka, Krasnogorivka has not been encircled in various offensive maneuvers in the last 2 years. They just started focusing on this year. Now, one thing that's interesting about Krasnogorivka is that this week the Russians actually made a daring, giant motorized attack. They basically broke through here and entered kind of. Let me show you here. They actually entered this kind of residential area right here. They actually are battling kind of right to the east of this street right here. So this street here, and the Russians are trying to battle for this area right here. There's been clashes in these like kind of buildings right here, but the Russians are trying to fully secure themselves right here. Along with this, the Russians, as we've been talking about, have been trying to secure themselves along this rail line. However, the Ukrainians have somehow managed to beat the Russians back and still have control over these areas. And we know this because the Russians have been bombing this area, showing that the Ukrainians still have positions here. But again, it looks like the Russians are now trying to are gearing up for another offensive push to clear out these residential area, have the new front line be along this rail line, and then also have like kind of position right here. And this kind of would give a good defense line the Ukrainians will try to force themselves to go back to the main defense point of the Ukrainians, which is in this factory right here. This is where the Ukrainians have their major defense point. And then they also have the part of the traditional 2014 defense line, which runs here and kind of uses these high-rise buildings right here as a defense. However, if this factory falls and this like kind of high-rise building section of Krasnogorivka falls, then everything else is very easy to collapse. So, Krasnogorivka is gonna, the Russians made some sort of daring operation to continue trying to give themselves a foothold here. They want to have some sort of foothold in Krasnogorivka. But however, my thing is that if they cannot secure themselves, if they cannot like cut off Krasnogorivka, this can be a tall order. The Ukrainians could still send forces through here, and that is why I think that once they clear out the northern sector, once they take Natalova and all that, I think they're going to then focus on trying to advance through these fields, kind of use the advantage here to start creeping up towards this line to cut off Krasnogorivka from the north, because that's the only way they're going to be able to break this stalemate. The Ukrainians are able to give fierce resistance because, again, they've built this up since 2014, so this is a very heavily fortified town, but the Russians are still trying to make some sort of foothold here, and once they make that foothold, I think they're just going to wait until the northern sector is clear so the Russians from the north could try to start cutting Krasnogorivka from the north. Because they need to capture Krasnogorivka, which I think will be the final battle to say what they call save Donetsk, basically just save Donetsk from Ukrainian artillery. While we're here, let's talk about the South Donetsk area. Let's talk about Nova Mikhailovka. The Russians are still advancing. As they mentioned about 2 weeks ago, they took the center, and now they are slowly but surely advancing towards the western part of the town. The Russians, by some rumors, say have captured fully these dachas right here above this fishing pond. And the rumor is that the Ukrainians are trying to retreat back to Perestrolovka here, this tiny village right here. And so the Russians are trying to push from the south, from this area, and from here. And this this onslaught is going to try to force the Ukrainians out of the western part of Nova Mikhailovka. This week they took another section of another couple of new blocks. So they're slowly but surely pushing themselves against the western part of Nova Mikhailovka. While they're doing so, they're also securing themselves more better in the northern part of Nova Mikhailovka right here. Again, these areas are fully, taking Pojeba was a very good strategic goal from the Russians, or tactical, but the Ukrainians have a lot of trenches out in the open here. There's just trenches galore, and they're not going to let the Russians get to the northern outskirts of Konstantinovka or Purisk, whatever the fuck. And again, there's also trenches, here. This might look like these are just fields, but the Ukrainians have built this up very much so, because this has been a static front line for a long while. And, the way the Russians are going to be able to take these villages along this area, especially Konstantinovka, is basically they need to advance along the fields in the north and along the fields in the south. And that's going to be a tall order, because any advance in the fields is hard work. So Nova Mikhailovka, the Ukrainians are getting squeezed out city block by, or village block by village block towards Perestroivka, Konstantinovka, and I expect this village to fall by the end of the month. So slow but sure progress in the southwest here. Let's go up to the next kind of biggest part of the front, which is the Bakhmut sector. So the Ukrainian the Russians are making a lot of solid progress here. This week we basically got confirmation that basically all of Bogdanovka has fallen. We got that from the Ukrainian sources. The Russian MOD has not confirmed that yet, I do not think. The Ukrainians have basically fallen back to Kalinova right here, and basically are using Kalinova as kind of the new defense line along with Grigorivka. So they're trying to have a new kind of defense point here. One thing that's kind of holding up the Russians here is that Bogdanovka itself is on the lowland, and then there's like a hill. There's like a tactical hill right here, and the Russians are trying to clear this area. So the battles for this is going on, but they cannot reliably secure themselves in they've taken Bogdanovka fully. However, they need to take this hill right here, this forest hill, and then this hill right here with this farmhouses to be able to actually secure themselves in Bogdanovka and use it as a springboard to start attacking Kalinova. So Bogdanovka has fully fell. One thing that the Bogdanovka falling has facilitated is that the Russians, according to some sources, have entered these dachas right here, and they're battling for these dachas right here. They're kind of using this kind of rail line as a natural defense point. And again, the Russians have a small, kind of like a small foothold in the outermost edges of Chasiv Yar. And once they take these dachas right here, they could put pressure on one end and on the other end. Again, they're trying to squeeze the Ukrainians to the other side of the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal. So the Russians have taken Bogdanovka. They are fighting for this hill in the north. They are right now trying to secure themselves in these dachas to the north of this kind of incursion. I think they call this the canal. One thing that's very interesting here, though, however, is what's happening in the south of this canal, and it's basically the capture of this tree line right here. This is what the Ukrainians were using to try to defend Ivanivska. However, with the fall of Ivanivska and the fast advance of the Russians to the north of it, they managed to capture kind of these trenches that were in the north of that helped defend Ivanivska. And so now the Russians are almost to the canal, and the Russians are clearing up kind of the rest of this forest. And I expect by the end of next week that they'll basically be at this area. Once they capture the rest of this forest, this will put a lot of pressure. They'll be able to advance, put pressure from the south. Let's put it here. So let's kind of put this in perspective what the Russians are doing. So this week the Russians are continuously advancing a lot, in the south, in the north here. They've captured Bogdanovka. They're clearing up these dachas, and basically doing this, they're able to attack this kind of area. This is the goal. They're trying to capture this extension of Chasiv Yar. They are attacking in the front. They're going to be able to attack from the north, and then once this area is captured, they'll be able to attack from the south. These three pincers are hoping to squeeze them out, and the Ukrainians will fall back to kind of the center of Chasiv Yar, and kind of just use these as kind of like kind of like slow down. Their main defense is going to be the center of Chasiv Yar, and they're going to basically use this residential area behind the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal as something to slow the Russians down. But I think the Russians are going to continue advancing. They're going to try to start clearing up the flanks, and that means that once this kind of this canal zone falls, and the Russians reach the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal, they're going to start trying to clear up Kalinova, which will happen once they clear out this kind of hill, and also probably they're going to start seeing battles for Grigorivka because they need that to secure their flanks. Because they need to reach the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal here, and then start, advancing and cutting off Chasiv Yar, from the north here. This will cut off Chasiv Yar from the north. One thing also to talk about here is the Russians, once they reach here, they'll be able to start advancing south. So they'll use Ivanivska and their kind of positions in the north here to start battling for this forest right here. This is going to be a hard battle, but if the Russians are going to start advancing south, and if the Russians manage to capture this forest right here, it's basically game over for the Ukrainians still defending their gains from the summer 2023 offensive in Klishevka and Andriivka. Because once the Ukrainians in Klishevka and Andriivka notice that the Russians are cutting them off, they're going to fall back and go back to Bilohora, Delinovka, and Stuposhki here, and kind of, have a new defense line on the other side of the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal, and the Russians will be able to clear out Klishchiivka and Drivka. So the Russians are, but in order to do that, they had to take Ivanivska. They are taking this hill right here, and this will basically facilitate them able to go south and to the north here. Basically, the main goal here, I think, is to reach the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal, clear out the flanks, and then in the summer be able to start attacking Chasiv Yar, the center of Chasiv Yar, instead of just the more outer edges of Chasiv Yar. So I think they're just trying to clear out this to have they want to reach the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal and then use that as a springboard to encircle Chasiv Yar, at least on 3 sides, and then cut it off, and then, kind of the same thing we saw in Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and so forth. A lot of progress here. We also are seeing a lot of progress in the Seversk front. We are seeing the Russians battling for this chalk. I think they call this the chalk dome or whatever the fuck. Basically, the Russians are actually on this chalk block. We saw Ukrainians trying to drone strike the Russians advancing here. These are mostly Akhmat Chechen forces here. And so the Russians are now trying to, they cleared out the trenches in the south of this chalk, in the east, and now they are trying to basically advance up into this chalk and take this. If they manage to take this, this basically gives them the tactical advantage, a big tactical advantage in trying to reclaim Bielogorivka. So the Russians managed to enter this chalk, and they're now battling for this kind of tactical hill here. Along with this, the Russians are still putting pressure on Vimvka. They advance more along this rail line and manage to enter. Manage to try to battle for these kind of tree lines. And again, they're slowly but surely reaching Vimvka. However, if you look down, these are villages that no longer exist on the map. They only exist on paper. So Vimvka might have once been a village, but if you scroll down, you can see that everything was razed to the ground. There's nothing left. It looks like a alien invasion happened. Holy shit! This also looks like some sort of alien creature. Anyway, if you look at Ivano Dyarovka, right, this is another village that might exist on paper, but it got wiped out to the ground. There's literally nothing left here. So these villages exist on paper, but they don't actually really exist. But again, they're trying. They're trying to situate themselves to start advancing towards Seversk. My main thing here is that I think this is just kind of like a local offensive. They're trying to pin the Ukrainians in Seversk, because Seversk has been a front where the Ukrainians could lightly defend and then send over to Bakhmut. They want to, Chasiv Yar is the big goal, but if the Russians are pushing in Seversk, they won't be able to use their troops in Seversk to swing by to help the main Russian push towards Chasiv Yar. So again, more advances towards Vimvka. Let us now go towards here. I talked about how Kharkov might be where the Russians push if they do a big aerial offensive. For the Kupiansk and Liman fronts, no changes. Alrighty. Ugledar, and there's been some pushes towards Ugledar and Velika Novosolovka, but nothing major. I think they're just here they're starting to up the pressure here. I think Ugledar might be once they conquer Novomikhailivka and they start taking Konstantinovka, because once Konstantinovka falls, this will give the Russians the ability to outflank whatever, the reason why the Ukrainians were able to keep Ugledar is because of this massive coal mining complex to the right here in this red circle. And if the Russians are able to outflank it, they'll be able to attack it on 2 fronts, pin the Ukrainians here, and then be able to encircle Ugledar from 2 sides. So that's the hope that and once Ugledar falls and they're able to take these coal mines and Konstantinovka, this will make a new Russian kind of defense line. And then from there, the Russians will have the operational space to start advancing towards Karakova, Uspensky, and such like that. Try to clear this gully here and push the Ukrainians away from the rail line that connects Donetsk towards Mariupol and such. No changes on the Zaporozhye front. There's still clashes there, however. The Russians and Ukrainians are trying to fight over the center of Robotina. it is kind of a bit of a morale downer for the Ukrainians, because not only are they pushed out of Verbova, so now they no longer are threatening Verbova, they're now outside. The Russians have taken the most of the tree lines outside of the village, so they've secured this village. They've also now entered Robotina, a month ago, and now there are still clashes for this village. But again, this was the only village that the Ukrainians took in their main push in Zaporozhye. So it's I think, a bit of a morale downer that now they're still fighting over it. But again, the center of Robotina is being fought over, along with the tree lines outside of Verbova. But nothing big changed this week. Also, no big changes in Kherson. One thing that did happen, though, was the Russians are redoing their attacks on Ukrainian energy facilities. They managed to attack the Kiev, I don't know what the fuck it was called, but the one of the main power plants that supplied energy to Kiev. And basically that, the Russians used their new hypersonic missile for that, and that knocked out a bunch of electricity. And this was a big deal, and a lot of people are like, why are the Russians targeting Ukrainian power generation facilities? Because before they were only targeting the substations. And Putin basically confirmed that because the Ukrainians started attacking Russian energy facilities with drones, they now responded in kind. This is a tit for tat. So we're going to see, I think also it's there to disrupt the logistics of the Ukrainians as well, for whatever Russians plan for the summer. So that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you guys enjoyed the update. Give this video a like, and comment your thoughts, share this video around, and subscribe to my channel if you want to continue seeing the updates in the war in Ukraine. So aim high and wander on.